Thanks, folks. Far too kind. So my name's David Anderson. I'm going to talk about finding the Value Flywheel Effect. So I'm an architect with GP, and first time at ComSom, so it's brilliant. Like I was saying to a few people, I've been to Manchester many times at gigs or football matches, but I always look at ComSom with kind of sort of regret, thinking I really need to go someday. So I'm delighted to be here, and it's been a brilliant day so far. So just as a quick introduction for myself, I wrote this book. You heard from the panel, I worked in telecoms for many years, worked with Liberty Mutual 14 years, drove a big transformation at Liberty. And after I left Liberty, I was just going to take a few months off, and then it was actually Adrian Cockcroft says, you have to write a book. So I decided to write what we had done, the technique, which is the Value Flywheel Effect. It's published by IT Revolution. I co-wrote it with Mark McCann and Mike O'Reilly, two friends of mine who had worked a lot on the same project. And for like the three of us were working architects, we're practitioners. One thing about IT Revolution is they don't publish books by authors, they publish books by practitioners, which I think is IT. I've been a fan of IT Revolution forever. And I'm really happy the way this has played out, because it's almost seen as the playbook for cloud modernization, which I think is nice. And I'll explain what it is in a second, but there's a nice foreword by Adrian Cockcroft. Adrian Cockcroft is the guy that he took Netflix to the cloud, gave lots of really amazing talks years ago, and he worked on a bunch of stuff. He's like a architecture leader, and Simon Wardley, because I used a lot of his kind of mapping strategy. And it's nice to be in the kind of the Gene Kim kind of that kind of author set, because there's lots of brilliant books on IT Revolution. And for me, really, it's about. People often ask, why serverless? Why are you going serverless? And that's completely the wrong question. It's really about, when do we start modernization? Because it doesn't really have to happen when you move to the cloud. A lot of companies will migrate first, which I think is fair enough, maybe then measure and then modernize. The whole serverless-first principle is changing the way you work. That's the big change. Like I said earlier in the panel, if you just lift and shift to the cloud, that's not a bad piece of work, but you're not really going to get the benefits. And I think the serverless mindset, not necessarily Lambda, the serverless mindset is what kind of helps that journey. The Value Flywheel is kind of this is the way I've been working for years now, and it's really about joining business and technology strategy. How do we make these one thing? There's no such thing as the business. If you work in a company, you are part of that company. There's one approach. So really there's 4 phases. The first thing, this is the way I would always start. What's the clarity of purpose? Why are we doing this thing? What's the need? What's the North Star? I've been in many engineering teams where we've been building something and we don't really know why we're building it. That's not acceptable. Then challenge. How do you create an environment that people can speak up, they can challenge the thinking, that environment of success? How do you create psychological safety in the team and in the organization? That is hugely important. There's no point hiring really smart people and then not letting them speak. It's just really not a good idea. Third, next best action. This is really where the serverless-first strategy comes in. And by serverless-first, I really mean your first choice should be managed compute, some kind of managed service, and then fall back as you need to. So the whole idea of it's not serverless only. It's start with the managed service and then fall back if needed. And there's lots of valid reasons why you would fall back. And then finally, long-term value. Don't build quick POCs and throw them away. You'll think about something like the Well-Architected framework to build in a sustainable manner. And there's a whole bunch of really good practice to how you can build really well and sustainably. So once that starts spinning, you're off and running. It's more about a call to action. What you will do is you'll start to see inertia against this. We don't know why we're doing this. I'm not allowed to do this. Our tech choices, there's lots of reasons why, and you start to uncover this. By visualizing this kind of flywheel, you start to see that thing. And this isn't one thing that you would do over 2 years. You do this very quickly. And I've seen this way of thinking really opens up rapid movement. So I'm currently at I'm helping a company called GP, Globalization Partners. And the clarity of purpose is really simple for GP. It's how do we simplify and accelerate global employment? That's the mission statement. It's really straightforward. So when you think of what that is, I'll just explain now what GP do. So GP is an interesting company. They created this category in the market called employer of record. An employer of record is when say you're here in the UK and you want to hire someone in Brazil. Normally that's a pain because you've got to set up an entity in Brazil, you've got to learn all the laws, everything else. But GP have got presence in almost 200 countries. So you can go to GP and say, can you hire Bob in Sao Paulo? And that person will be hired as a full professional with a contract, paid whenever, their pension, taxes, benefits, all that, the things you need to be a compliant employee in that country. And GP do all that for you. And there's a fee on top of it. So I think it's a brand new category. I hadn't really heard of it, to be honest, before I joined GP. But as you can probably tell with the way things are going with remote working and the change through COVID, it's just hockey stick growth. And what you need to do that, GP was traditionally like an operations company with lots of HR and legal experts, and lots of in-country presence, and we're modernizing the whole company to be like a technology product company. So it really is like hockey stick growth. And the big differentiator for GP is compliance. It's absolutely compliance. So it's that, because effectively we're hiring people for customers. So everything needs to be super compliant. Super interesting problem statement. And I kind of want to tell the story of the flywheel effect through the current sort of what we're doing in GP. So let's start with a strategy. At GP, there's a really simple strategy. 3 things. Flexible evolution. How can we evolve quickly? This is a brand new market. You know, we don't really know. It's like what I would call a blue ocean opportunity. It's not like insurance or telecoms, which is really well understood. This is a brand new area that's growing, that's innovating quickly. So serverless-first means we can be flexible and travel at speed. SaaS scale, there's a global need. There's customers all over the world. We do need to be well-architected right the way across, and async as an event first. So we're using those kind of well-architected principles for SaaS scale. And then finally, empowered teams. We use domain-driven design and event-driven architecture to have empowered teams. So that means teams own the thing they're building outright. They own a business capability, not a project. So that's the 3 kind of architectural principles. So as we started to kind of roll this idea out, there's probably 3 things that are super important. The first being executive sponsorship. You can't do an organizational-wide modernization without the executive team being fully on board. You can do it in pockets, but you can't really do a grassroots movement. You need the board and the CEO to say, yes, this is a big part of our strategy. So we're lucky we have that, but that's so important for doing this type of work. Second, ADRs, architecture decision records. As an architect in the organization, all our decisions are documented out in the open. Any team can challenge, comment, even create an ADR. That's wide open. So we've lots of ADRs around serverless-first, event-first, the languages we use, how we deploy, how we do persistence, how we do network. It's all documented, the rationale at ADR. Sometimes that sounds kind of silly, but even when you go back and look at something that we wrote 18 months ago, you go, right, so that's why we're doing this. ADRs tend to build on top of each other, so it's really interesting to have them all in one place, and they're just on a wiki. And then third, enablement. This is really important. You can't tell people what to do. You need to help people do the right thing. As Luke said this morning, make the right thing easy. So there's a massive enablement function, I think, especially as an architecture team. There's probably 4, I would say, key influences for me personally, and for this area. Domain-driven design is massive. It's like 20 years old, but it's making a comeback. It's kind of cool again. There's a guy called Nick Tune who's written a brilliant book around architecture modernization. Lots of really brilliant techniques like event storming, etc. There's a lot of Nick's work that he's used to go into this book is there's a GitHub repo called DDD Crew. I would highly encourage you to Google DDD Crew. There's a repo on GitHub with all the content sitting there. I mean, buy the book as well, of course, but it's all sitting on GitHub. There's loads of brilliant stuff there about how to do this type of modernization. Gregor Holpus's book on the architect elevator, which I think is a brilliant concept. I remember when Gregor first wrote this in a blog a few years ago, it struck home with me. The ability to sit beside an engineer and pair program, be able to talk to a VP, to talk to the CEO. It's the same thing you're saying, but in a different way. How can you change the way you communicate and the way you operate? There are different levels within an organization. He calls it the basement and the penthouse, that you can take the elevator and talk to different audiences. Super important for an architect. Team Topologies by Matt Skelton, Matthew Emmanuel Pass. I think this is a brilliant book. When they first started, this was called DevOps Topologies. When you think in a team topologies way, there's a whole socio-technical thing about how you arrange teams. I think this is a brilliant book. It's a really simple concept, and I think it's brilliant. And obviously, I'll plug my own book. And really for the, it's really for Wardley Mapping. I think Wardley Mapping is a game changer when you're doing your technical strategy, when you're trying to figure out where do we need to get to. It's like, it's the secret sauce. And people would often say, how did you know this is going to happen in 2 years' time? It's like, we mapped this out. You could almost predict. For me, it's a way of predicting the future. Like, what do we think is going to happen? It's a super powerful technique, and that's really the main focus of the book. So just how many people have heard of Wardley Mapping? Show of hands. How many people are good at it? Yeah, it's really hard. They say it takes you 7 years to learn it, 6 years and 11 months of pain, and then a month at the end of, I think I've got this. So I'll show 2 quick maps. So this is kind of, I would say, the GP sort of problem statement. And the way you kind of read a Wardley map, so there's an anchor at the top, which is the customer. So this is a customer of GP, which is a company. So say someone like Microsoft, right? Or like Roblox or someone like that. So that's a customer. And then there's a value chain of needs. So the customer need is that they need to expand. And things at the top of the value chain are visible. Things lower down are less visible, right? So things get kind of murkier as you go down. And then the left to right, the evolutionary axis, this is the fun part. So there's really 4 phases. Every capability, technology will evolve. And there's been a bunch of research done on this. So when something starts, it's genesis. So it's brand new, it's a wonder. How does this even work? This is amazing. It's an age of wonder. So like Gen AI was kind of wonder, was genesis a few years ago. Then we start to get good at it. We think we can build it, but we can't really build it well. It becomes custom build. This thing is valuable, but we're still getting good at it. Then it evolves over into product. This means there's customer demand. The person or the company who can build this well will actually get the market. And then eventually something becomes commodity or utility. It's like the price of doing business. The way I always describe this is think of computers. Back in the 50s, like computers were like ENIAC and stuff. It was Genesis, it's magic. Then it became custom. Like there was news stories of the bank have got a computer and it was custom built for the bank and it shows you them rolling into the office. And it became a news story. Then it became product with like the PC and Windows. Everyone had them. And now it's Genesis or commodity. It's just the cloud. It's nothing special to have a computer. We've all got 3 or 4 probably on us between watches and phones, etc. So for this map here, you can see the customer needs to expand, and there's a couple of dependency things. They define people, so there's knowledge and integration that rely on country compliance. They need to hire people, which GP are better at. That requires capabilities on a platform, and they need to manage people, which that's how GP have always been quite good at. You know, doing payroll and things like that. That requires in-country presence. So to build a properly compliant platform that's integrated, you need to have that expertise and resiliency, and that's all based on technology. And really the modernization story is how do we shift that technology to commodity? We don't have the time or kind of like resources to have a lot of custom-built technology. So that's the strategy at a high level. Kind of at a lower level, if you think of an engineer in the team, right? So you're an engineer in the team in GP. You have a need to create an application. So like probably the older application would have been on cloud, on EC2, Spring Boot Java, but in a monolith. So like not bad state, but so what we've done is we have a couple of evolutions, a couple of moves. We want to move from monolith Java over to lightweight functions. We're going to move for like package components, they bound to contexts, point-to-point the eventing. So that's serverless-first moves our idea of how we actually, you know, how do we learn about this? Like observation number 5, continuous improvement and learning. How do we build in a different way? Down to the right there, integration. In order to build differently, we need to embrace EDA. So number 3 there is EDA now becomes the foundation. So event bridge everywhere. So that becomes the foundation for this new architecture. It's a domain-driven architecture, which another accelerator is event and domain-driven. If you've got event and domain driven, then you need good observability to move that from by application to distributed open telemetry. Data becomes a shared database by each federated across the organization. Infrastructure becomes in a shared account over the multi-account, which is the modern cloud management and governance, what I'd say. So that's another accelerator, being well architected. And then even how engineering think, either by function, as in architecture, engineering, test, product, but with agency, where people wholly own a capability. And that's going towards that sort of shift in mindset to empowered product teams. So you can see how a lot of the strategy builds up. So to kind of create that learning culture, there's a couple of things that you would think aren't that related, like how you design your multi-account, multi-bus architecture, or infrastructure, sorry. So that's how we sort of mapped out what this change would look like. But that's all theory, that's just a diagram. One of the things with the modernization is you've got to kind of find the hook. What's the thing that the organization really need? And we were kind of lucky enough, this is now before I was involved in the organization, there was an inertia point where teams couldn't move fast enough. So maybe 35 squads, centralized QA, releasing every 2 weeks. Just a traditional kind of monolith. All the right technical icons, but not organized in the right way. So what the team, this is probably back about 2022, I'd say. There was, if you think of the DORA scores around throughput, it was very high cognitive burden. Everything was complicated. Everyone was in the same code base, in a shared database account. Lots of things overlapping, shared database tables. Not really well architected. Lots of the 5 pillars, not that great. Continuous delivery, very slow throughput, and not good product autonomy. A lot of things kind of stamping on each other. So then we started that flywheel, and this is, so we decided to pick one area, which was billing, which is how we do payments. So let's fix that. So we broke payments out into an account and pricing, 2 different domains. We used Well-Architected as a way to kind of assess and make sure there's quality. Serverless-First to kind of rebuild and start to break apart the monolith. Event-driven architecture to event back and forward to get that scale. Threat modeling to make sure we were sort of, we were assessing all our risks and mitigating. And then SCORP, which is our way of operationalizing Well-Architected. And in doing this, and probably over about maybe, this was really only maybe about 4 teams, we started to notice that cognitive burden dropped because there were smaller kind of batch sizes, and the other pillars went up. So we started to come from, in DORA language, low performing to elite performing. So this is just on maybe on we'll say 15% of the business, but a very important part of the business. So that was kind of the proof point. The thing then is, again, the executive sponsorship. When you sit down with the CFO and say, look at how we've changed things, we went from high run cost, high toil, to low run cost and high business value. What I would call the rate of turn, how quickly we can adapt to changes and innovate, went through the roof. So we started to see, not just nice, shiny technical improvements, but actual improvements in the business. A lot of innovative around how we do payments. And you think of international payments, it gets pretty complicated. Time to value, improved cash flow, better experience, better customer experience. And that kind of, you see automation, operational efficiency, less manual workarounds for this stuff. So that was kind of the basis of, right, we've proved that we can do this. Now let's do it at scale. So that was a really important kind of, again, to the thing that if you need to modernize, don't try and do the whole company at once. It's often good to just do a part and kind of show the change and then scale it out. So as we kind of proved that, this approach works, let's kind of spin the file. Let's really speed up how we do this. So we kind of pitched the large-scale modernization probably about 2 years ago, I'd say. Would have been towards the end of 22. And it probably kicked off at the start of 23. So the way we kind of talked about this was through enabling constraints. I'm a big fan of enabling constraints. I don't like to say, as an architect, here's exactly the thing that you must do. John Cutler is a great, his stuff is brilliant. He's like a kind of product thought leader. He talks about making things better with enabling constraints. It's kind of to show empowerment in the teams. I'll not go through these, but the stuff on the right is bad process, restrictive. It's kind of like keep people in their teams and keep the kind of factory mindset. The stuff on the right is more of a learning environment, open teams up, led by principals. That's when you get the best out of teams. So that's kind of the attitude we took. So we're going to walk through 6 enabling constraints as we scale this solution. The first is backstage. This is massively important. When you think of platform engineering, the way you expose that platform, internal platform, to the engineers is through an internal developer platform. So even Backstage obviously was open sourced by Spotify a few years ago. We don't even install Backstage. We get it as a managed service from a company called Roadie. That's R-O-A-D-I-E. So they host Backstage for us. So what we do then is we use this as the place that engineers go to see their kind of service inventory, to request new components, this would put templates. If you want a new account, you go in through Backstage and request your new account. So this is the kind of the front door where we try and focus on fast flow. This is our access point for engineers building. And it's the way we can standardize. Second is, for the skills that we use, rather than me sitting around a bunch of documents saying this is what I think should happen, we say go to serverless land, you should read that. If you want to have an opinion in EDA, use the opinion that these guys have. Use AWS as almost like, use the best practices that they publish. So that means we reduce any customizations that we think we should have. You often see big companies will say that, we're special, we need a bunch of different stuff because we've been in business for such amount of time. Don't be doing that. Try and keep stuff as bare bones as possible so you can use out of the box. We're at the point now when if AWS bring out a new lab, we can use it that day or the next day because there's no extra stuff we need to add. So try and keep things as standard as possible. That means engineers can go to events like this, hear things, and try them straight away. We're not too opinionated in how people do stuff. Third is the well-architected test. Every workload has a well-architected review. And that's kind of, and it's more than just using it as a process. Almost like the term well-architected is understood across the company. So I want to get to a point where people in the C-suite and leaders will, if a team will say, we've built this new thing, they will even say it's like a demo in an exec meeting. Someone will say, is that well-architected? And there's 2 answers to that, yes and no. It's not like, it depends. Well, we've done some, and what well-architected is a very specific meaning. So this becomes our standard of quality. And we have a process called SCORP, which we use. Now, SCORP is an acronym for security, cost, operational excellence, reliability, and performance. It's a different order, but we just use that because it's less of a mouthful than well-architected. And really, we wanted this. And the thing, I think well-architected is a brilliant framework, but when you go through the tool, AWS's tool, there's a lot of checkboxes, there's a lot of stuff there. It's not exactly fun, you know what I mean? It is an audit, it's super detailed, but for regular engineering teams, it's a lot of work. So what we did was we thought, how can we remove the friction from well-architected? So what we do, we ask every single team to create their own dashboard, a low-fidelity dashboard, basically a wiki page, and it's split up by the pillars. It's usually it's usually performance, security, operational excellence, reliability, and cost. And they'll just list all their figures. They'll take them out of New Relic, Cost Explorer, wherever, Sneak. They'll take all their figures out and they'll put them in a flat table. And we can see the trends month on month. And then we meet every team, usually every month, and they'll say, here's how my figures are looking. So what we do is we create space for a conversation between the whole team, not just the tech lead, and usually the architect, to say, I noticed there for these lambdas, that performance has gone up. What happened? Well, yeah, we're not quite sure. We think it's this. And you might say, did you run the power tuner? Yeah, but so you just have an open conversation. It's a bit like a blameless postmortem, but I almost call it a blameless pre-mortem. We're actually talking about what do we think might happen. One of the things that we find with this process is we catch things before they happen. Because it's almost like you're giving the team permission to sort of sit and let's have a conversation about non-functional requirements. Usually the product manager won't say, let's have a deep dive on reliability. It's just expected. So we create the time and space through this SCORP process. They actually talk about the 5 pillars and trend metrics. And we don't compare teams. Every team will trend differently, you know. It just depends on their context, their application, their maturity. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but again, it's a brilliant process, and we've this running over like 30 teams. So there's this community of well-architected best practices. I think it's a brilliant process. I've rolled this out across, we came up with this idea probably maybe about 8 years ago, and there's probably, I'd say, there's hundreds of teams that are following this process now across different companies, and it's absolutely brilliant. And the nice thing about it is the knowledge of this process is in the Well-Architected framework, which is updated all the time by Amazon. So there's a constant update of best practices, which is brilliant. It almost encourages you to stay up to date. The fourth kind of enablement thing is threat modeling. Like, you can't have AppSec do security for the team. Like that doesn't work. AppSec will need to do whatever they do, but the team need to own their own security. They need to own their risk. So a technique that I discovered maybe 15 years ago was STRIDE, which stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So every team, when they have a workload, will go through their STRIDE DFD, identify risks and mitigations. This is a brilliant process for helping teams understand their risk and what they're doing about it. And then AppSec can add an extra layer on top of that. Like, this is super important. Like, we use EventBridge for our EDA, so our eventing kind of backbone, and that's standard across the entire organization. So there's no debate about how do I send you this message. It's EventBridge. It's that simple. So this gives us that kind of standard, and it sits really well with domain-driven design. That's one of David Bowney's kind of sketches. And again, we can use the brilliant material that David Bowney has around EDA and EventBridge and have our teams use that directly. The fact that, and this aligns, I would say, application development, product, and infrastructure. It keeps it all kind of the same. Again, single service, single standard. And for that, we use a multi-account, multi-bus strategy. And finally, choice. When teams are implementing a workload, what we try and say is, let's keep it simple, because you want to reduce cognitive load. So it was Gregor Hope there, Gregor's Law. Excessive complexity is nature's punishment for organizations that are unable to make decisions. So we say to engineers, if you're building a workload, start with these 4. Just start with Lambda, Dynamo, EventBridge, and API Gateway. That's your start. Now, if you realize that Dynamo is not good enough, fine, use something else. But don't just use RDS because that's what you know. Start with these 4, keep it super simple, and then see what happens. And teams tend to do that, and it works for most cases. Then you start to, once you reduce that cognitive load, you're reducing operational overhead. So we're using other tools like Trusted Advisor, Security Hub, Resiliency Hub. Because of the way we've designed our accounts, we can basically turn on all these tools in the background to fully monitor what we're doing. So again, trying to keep the choice limited. So that's our 6, what I would say, enabling constraints. There's a lot there, but working together, I think they are quite powerful. So let me give you a kind of illustration of a typical kind of project. So there's a great quote here by Adrian Cockcroft. I think there's something he said at Netflix. You don't add innovation to the culture, you just get out of its way. You know, the whole thing is about empowered product teams. Like AWS is our platform. We have conventions, and then just let the team go. That's what's powerful here. So let's take something a kind of project. The first thing I would say, if there's a team, if there's an idea, is don't think about the technology, think about the capabilities. So that's the team need to build a capability to give the customers advice, maybe for documents, for billing, for country compliance. Think about the capability. What's the business need of the thing you're building? Start with that. The first question I'd ask a team is, what's your KPI for this thing? They'll say, oh, the SLA of 200 million. Like, no, what's your functional KPI? And often they go, I don't know, ask the product manager. It's like, well, let's figure that out, because we're not building something if we don't know what it's going to contribute. And often it takes a while to figure that out. So think about capabilities and how we measure that capability. And this may evolve, but that's where you have to start. So then we'll go into event storming. Like this year, we had an idea, probably towards the end of next year, about a way we're going to roll out how we do compliance across countries. So and I worked on this myself. So the first thing we did was, I think it was last January, February, we had an event storming session. Is anybody familiar with event storming? Go hands up. Good few people. Okay. So event storming, we actually use a technique called event bridge storming. It's documented by a guy called Ben Ellerby from Elios. He's an AWS hero on Medium. He's blogged about this. And he's kind of taken, Alberto Brandolini had the original approach of event storming, and kind of Ben has kind of adapted that for Event Bridge. So the wee black boxes there are the kind of process. So what we do is you pretty much get everyone in the room, like on a Zoom call, including like who's the domain expert, the product person, the engineer, the manager, the architect, everyone's in the room. So we say, how do we build this thing? So we'll start off with, I'll kind of talk through these boxes. You start off at the top, like, okay, what does this process do? We'll say, here's the different phases. We'll just kind of do a brain dump on Lucid. Then in the second box there, we kind of try and line them up like a process flow. And then the third box, we start to introduce, is that a command? Is that an event? Is that persistence? You know, kind of add the sort of the action around that. And then the bottom right box there, we'll draw circles as we identify boundaries and domains. So that pretty much tells us, we think there's 6 domains in this process flow. So that's 6 workloads we have to build. So we all do that as a group. So, and that probably, sometimes I often find that maybe takes like, say, 2 1-hour sessions or 2 90-minute sessions. You can get it on in the morning, but I often like to split it in 2. So that's how you discover your domains and boundaries. Most importantly, it also helps you discover what we don't know. Oh, nobody knows how this bit works, right? Is that just nobody knows in this room or nobody knows at all? It's like, right, well, let's do some discovery. So having the idea of trying to discover the system. I don't mean the tech system, the actual system of how this thing works in our business. So then one of the things that we use a multi-account strategy. So we offload all the work to AWS. So there's a great white paper called Organizing Your AWS Environment Using Multiple Accounts. I talked about those 6 domains. Each of those domains is a workload. Each of those workloads is its own AWS account. So that's a full account where that workload lives. So we use Control Tower. So we'll have a few kind of operational things like security, infrastructure, etc. But then we'll have the workloads. So for each workload, there'll be a dev account, a test account, and a production account. So that's 3 accounts, 3 AWS accounts for that one workload. So what this is I would say this is a more advanced way of kind of doing your sort of DevOps. Like traditionally, you might have a very large cloud platform engineering team that do a lot of work. Then you get towards this kind of 50-50. What we're going to is the right, is that the team do a lot of the work, and there's a very thin platform team. Now, we still have a fairly significant cloud infrastructure team because there's a lot of work to do, but the teams have the autonomy and the ownership of their account. We put a lot of constraints around that, but they pretty much, it feels to the team that they own their account and they are in charge of their own destiny. So that's kind of really important as part of the strategy. So in the last diagram, we had a new idea. We broke it into 6 domains. So say one team wants to build a domain. I apologize for the slide, it looks horrible, but I'm trying to figure out a nice way of displaying this. So once the team say, right, I want to build a domain, it's been assigned to a team that's like, I don't know, say a billing team. The first thing I want them to do is create a dev account. So they define the bounded context. Again, the first question is, what's your KPI? What do you think the services are? What events? What does this thing do? Just a high level kind of almost like a one-pager. If the team don't know, then there's no point going forward. If they've thought this through, provision a dev account. So now they have their own account. Now they have console access to that account, and it's pretty open, so they can go in and do what they want. They'll probably build like an MVP or an early build, and then they want to create a test account. So you see here, we've got the 5 pillars of SCORP, of Well-Architected. So what they'll do is that initial solution, I'll ask the team to do a threat model, so identify how data flows and where the risk is, and we'll run Security Hub to make sure that's clear, so there's no silly mistakes in that workload. We'll make sure the team are aware of their cost intelligence dashboard, using kind of the kudos stuff, so they understand exactly how much this costs and where their spend is. Usually the cost for an account is about like $40 a month or something, very small, but the team understand their kind of FinOps profile. Then from an operational perspective, we'll do an actual well-architected review with the serverless lens on the tool. We'll go through those 9 questions. Get the team starting their SCORP process. Any business entities that they look at, they'll have those schemas in our data governance, which is Databricks and Atlan. And then they create their GitHub deployment pipelines, and Trusted Advisor is clear findings. Then they'll build their integration tests and their performance tests. At that point, we provision a test account. So the test account has no console access, and there's more SCPs kind of turned on, so it's a bit more compliant. Often, team will say, oh, I need to just log in to change. No. So it needs to be fully infrastructure as code. That's them getting ready to go to production. Then we have a couple of final checks around additional security scans around maybe Sneak, for example. We'll lock down the repos. They might set alarms for spend once they understand that. We'll make sure the observability is telling us that the KPIs that we can see it. They'll have runbooks, playbooks, they'll have their Slack set up, a decent test plan for production. Then we give them a production account, and then they can deploy at will. So they might get the production account and not deploy for another 2 months. It's now they've gone through that process. This is our workload readiness checklist. So it kind of shows all the different lenses, how we go through it. And a lot of this is kind of automated. I do need a nicer way to show this. And so the teams that are, I'd say, mature can go through this very quickly. So I kind of talked about that process that we talked about this year. So we started to put this live over the summer. So each of these boxes are kind of like domains, and the clouds are bound to context. And you can see a process as someone logs in. They start a process. They call out to the compliance, the new piece we built. There's a few events going back and forward. They onboard like a professional. They put some stuff in a platform. They create a contract, and that's all synced. So that shows you that's almost like the event storming picture now in infrastructure. So you can almost directly relate that. If we have called a domain in the event storming customer, it'll be called customer in here. So that there's a mental model. For each of the bounded contexts, like I said, there's an architecture diagram of a fairly simple one. You can see here there's Event Bridge consuming a bunch of events on the left. There's Event Bridge on the right where a few events are being produced. You have a bunch of lambdas and a few step functions where people are writing single business functions per component. You've got an API gateway there, consuming 2 calls. Everything's written in the Dynamo, and there's a connection to something else. Like, it's that simple. Do you know what I mean? But again, this reflects the fact that it's a sort of it's constraints to make sure the team build quickly. And then we're getting to the point where we're just starting to look at now. David Barney gave a great talk earlier about Event Bridge and EDA, or Event Catalog. So we're looking at Event Catalog to try and comprehend the system. When you do build like an EDA across the whole organization, it's really hard to visualize it, to comprehend that system. So we're thinking about, can we take in our open APIs, ASIC APIs, services, events, and display them in Event Catalog? So we're experimenting with this. We're still kind of building this out at the minute, but I think there's good promise in it. We want to visualize these interactions. So these aren't just architecture diagrams. It's actually a picture of the live system. We observe through OpenTelemetry. We use OpenTelemetry to make sure we've got stats on what's happening. And then we monitor quality through the tools like Trusted Advisor, Security Hub, Resiliency Hub. And what I think is really nice about this, you go from a business capability to the design, to the build, to the observation, right the way through. So some of the learnings. So what I found certainly with this engagement, clarity of purpose is something that I'd always insisted on in the past. If the company are in a brand new space that like the industry is still trying to figure out what it is, we don't really know what the clarity of purpose is. There's several things we could go after. So we need the ability to be able to pivot and try things out. So clarity of purpose, it's harder than you think because sometimes the market changes and you have to go with that. You can't, as an engineer, you can say, I insist on a KPI or not building anything. Sometimes you have to say, well, let's make up a KPI, and then you realize that maybe it was the wrong one. So it's actually, like I say, in more mature industries, that's a lot easier. In newer industries, it's a bit more difficult. The challenge, often when you hire engineers from other companies, like you big enterprises, they haven't worked in this way. They'll bring sort of ideas. So you have to let teams experiment and learn. And, you know, I wouldn't say make big mistakes, make small mistakes. People need to try stuff out and then understand why some of these constraints are there. Serverless and EDA are really difficult to learn. They're not trivial. It does require, I think it's you see more of the system as an engineer, and that's sometimes tough. So I think we have to be sort of empathetic on that. And then finally, like well-architected, I've been looking at well-architected for about 10 years now. It's an absolute goldmine of information, but most people haven't really heard of it or don't really understand the framework. And there's an awful lot of knowledge there. There's hundreds of questions and thousands of best practices, but it's definitely something that I would say all engineers and even the engineer managers take time and understand the framework and what it's actually saying. It's really important. One thing that actually happened last year is Nat, our Chief Product and Strategy Officer, one of the teams were being very sort of, I would say, very waterfall-esque in how they were working. And he said, let's get scrappy. And I thought it was a great term. And what he was kind of saying was, and there's this guy, Nick Westergaard, wrote a book called Get Scrappy. And he's this lovely quote. But it's not about enabling the latest shiny thing. It's about get scrappy, about getting something out there. It's almost like the next version of MVP. You know, try and test out what you think is going to be there and see what happens. Sometimes you don't know what's next. So when a technical strategy like I've laid out, it allows us to pivot. Case in point, when the Gen AI explosion happened, we could just kind of experiment in that way straight away. We didn't have to change our whole strategy. The strategy didn't change at all. We could embrace that. EDA maturity, I think, is tough. Again, enterprises don't think in EDA, so trying to convert the mindset is really tough. I've had lots of people say, we should just write a shared Java library. It's like, no, that's a single point of failure. Visibility, we're making some progress in this, but it's really hard to visualize the technical system and then even the teams on top of that. There's a whole socio-technical element where it's the technology and the teams. It's really hard to get your head around that. And then the asynchronous behavior. We still program synchronously. It's really hard for people to get their head around events and just waiting and retries and stuff. That's still, it hurts people's heads. When you say API, people often think synchronous REST, but API could be any number of things. I think this is fascinating. I think it's the trinity of serverless-first, offloading all that work to the provider, event-driven architecture, being async, and then thinking domain-driven design. I think doing this at scale across a big company, I think is super interesting. If you're doing this, I would love to talk to you. And then finally, sort of continuous compliance. We're moving too fast for annual audit. So by having the well-architected strategy we have, we can have everything turned on around monitoring. With serverless-first, we can make sure that we're using all the best practices out of the box. And then EDA is that kind of glue, ties everything together. Again, that sits back to the original kind of goal about being compliant in the organization. That goes right through to our technology. So that's pretty much it. You can see the purpose of the talk is finding the value flywheel effect. Sometimes you need to figure out like what this picture looks like for your organization and just get moving on it. It's not about sitting trying to plan it for 18 months. It's about understanding what the goals are and moving swiftly towards them. And again, that idea of joining business technology strategies is so important. So that's me. I would say, again, I stress again, migration is not modernization. The book's around. I'd be super interested to hear any feedback on it. Please, I do some writing as well on the serverlessage.com blog, and we have a podcast, myself, Mark and Mike, where we talk nonsense on the podcast. It's good fun. It's pretty lighthearted. Please reach out. I'll be more than happy to talk to anyone. I think this is the next big area that companies and teams need to work through. So I think we're only kind of at the crest of a wave on this. So super interested to hear what you think, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for that. We got any questions? Go here.
Hello, I'm Georgia. I'm an engineer. That was super interesting. So many brilliant tools to use. My question is, if your team's modernizing, sometimes by the time you get to the modernization end, you need to modernize again. Because things move on. So how do you balance building new features, new products with consistently staying modern?
I think it's a great question. So the question is, modernization is a big effort, and sometimes it can take a long time to modernize. By the time you're done the effort, you need to start again and modernize again. That's a really hard balance. One of the things that I like to measure is time to value. It's kind of a play on time to market. It's how quickly can we get features out that is required by the organization. And if you can measure time to value, because there's a massive danger here of analysis paralysis, where we sit and shoegaze. That's why we kind of did that billing example first, just to show the value. So I think it's a really difficult balance, but you can't rush it either, because if you do these big foundational changes too fast, you can, they say move fast and break things, but not with your entire cloud infrastructure, So I think it's really hard to find that value. I would think time to value is a really important metric as a KPI, I think.
I think we had one here.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. I'll definitely check out the book. I was wondering if there's sort of an implied thing here around the... Oh. I've just leant on my keys and it set off my thing to find my keys. Sorry. I've told it I've found my keys. I'm so sorry. Whether this applies more to organizations who already see technology as something that enables or adds value. You
Yes.
mentioned executive sponsorship versus perhaps organizations who are still in that mindset of tech's a cost center, tech's an implementation detail. Because I feel like doing some of these things in that latter style of organization would actually be really challenging.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So the question is around, is the executive team and board do they see the value of technology? And if they don't, it's hard to do this. It absolutely is. I love Nicole Forsgren in Accelerate. When she brought that book, when that book came out, I think about 2017, and I bought about 20 copies and gave it to the entire executive team to read this book. And if you're too busy, just read chapter 2. It's 4 pages. And she says that IT is not a cost center. It's a differentiator for change. It's a growth opportunity. And the way I used to translate that was, is it the top line or bottom line? So if you're focused on the bottom line, if you're trying to save a few pennies, which is important, you're better to focus on the top line, which how can we grow our customer base or grow our business, and then keep the bottom line as something that's still important. You still have to mind it, but Well-Architected will do that for you. Focus on the value statements about what value can we create, not what money we can save, So that's, but if a company aren't interested in being strategic and growing, that's tough. You might not be in business much longer.
I think we've got time maybe for one more. Sure. Oh, there's some guy there. I'll give him the chance.
Hi, can I be cheeky and ask 2 questions? Firstly, you pitched this at the business level, that we should be doing this at the business level. Can it also apply at team level? And also, the second part of it is you talked about teams managing their accounts, and I just wondered, in terms of permissions, how would you slice up permissions for the teams? Do you just give them administrative access over the accounts that they manage, or is it least privilege that you follow?
Sure. No, great question. So first question was, this is pitched to the organization. Could you also pitch it to teams, the concept? And second, if a team owns their account, do they get administrative access to the account? So, absolutely, you can pitch this to teams. I think, we've done this with teams in the past. You can kind of move at pace. You can embrace some of the event-driven Serverless-First principles at a team level, and especially that way of thinking about that flywheel. What's our clarity of purpose? Let's create the environment and let's move. So you can, I started with a lot of these concepts in teams, and then scaled them up to organizations. So they absolutely apply for teams. The infrastructure question is a good one. We use control tower and organizational units for there's their inheritance model, so the teams don't get full admin access. That's part of what the cloud platform team will do, is manage that access. So any of the break glass procedures are through the cloud team. They write a ticket for the cloud team if they get into trouble, but they'll have access to the account, but not admin access. So we still have admin accounts separately.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was really good. I'm sure if you've got any more questions, you want my interview, grab them afterwards.
I'll be about in the club area afterwards, so more than happy to connect or have a chat or just grab a drink. Cool. And thank you.
Thank you.